The morning my mother's hand connected with my cheek at my sister's wedding reception, I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. Not broken, not afraid. Quiet. The way a storm goes quiet right before it takes the roof off the house. Let me back up, because you need to understand what kind of family we are before you can understand what kind of woman I became inside of it. The Fontaines of Chicago, Lakeshore Drive specifically, because my mother Claudette would sooner die than let you forget the zip code, are the kind of people who perform love the way others perform surgery. Precisely. Coldly. With the understanding that one wrong move could kill the patient. So my father, Reginald Fontaine, built his commercial real estate empire on three things: connections, silence, and the ability to make people believe they owed him something. My mother built her entire identity on being his wife and on the idea that her daughters existed as extensions of her ambition. My sister Bianca was the favorite, always had been, always would be. Bianca with her soft laugh and her agreeable opinions and her talent for making Claudette feel like the most important woman in whatever room they shared. And then there was me, Elsa, the one who left. I left at 22 with a finance degree from Northwestern, $40 in my checking account, and a ferocious, bone-deep refusal to be managed. I moved to Manhattan. I worked until my eyes bled. I built Fontaine Capital. Management from a one-desk operation in a sublet in Midtown to a boutique investment firm with 16 employees, a client roster that read like a Forbes list, and a penthouse on the 53rd floor of a building in Tribeca that had a waiting list longer than most people's credit history. I did all of this without a single dollar from Reginald Fontaine. And that, not my success, not my intelligence, not even my absence, was the thing my family could never forgive me for. Here is what nobody tells you about escaping a controlling family. The leash does not disappear. It just gets longer. I got the call about Bianca's wedding 6 months before it happened. My mother's voice on the phone was the same voice she used for charity galas and passive aggression. Honeyed, precise, and carrying a current underneath it like electrical wire in water. Your sister needs you there, Elsa, as her maid of honor. I almost laughed. Bianca and I hadn't spoken more than pleasantries in 3 years. But I said yes, because saying no would have cost me more than the trip back to Chicago, and because somewhere under all the scar tissue, I still loved my sister. I just wasn't sure she knew how to love me back. The wedding was at the Langford Estate in Lincoln Park. Rented out for the occasion, 200 guests, a string quartet, a 5-course dinner with a sommelier who pronounced everything like he was being graded. Bianca looked stunning, she always did. Her dress was custom, off-white silk with a cathedral train, and she floated down the aisle toward her fiancé, a real estate attorney named Prescott Halley, like she had been designed specifically for this moment. Standing at the altar in a sage green bridesmaid gown that Claudette had selected, it photographs beautifully. Elsa, don't make a face. I watched my sister become Mrs. Haley and felt something complicated move through my chest. Pride and grief and a low-grade sorrow I couldn't name. The grief of watching someone you love disappear into a life that looks like happiness, but might just be a very convincing set. Cocktail hour was smooth. I smiled for photos. I toasted the couple with a speech I'd written on the plane that made 200 people laugh and cry in the right places. Claudette touched my arm afterward and said that was adequate, which, from her, was practically a standing ovation. My father shook my hand like I was a business associate he respected but didn't trust. Prescott's mother, a woman named Georgette Halley, who wore 3 strands of pearls and looked like she'd been born disapproving of something, told me I looked very metropolitan, which I took as the compliment I'm sure she didn't intend it to be. And then the reception started. And that is when things got interesting. It was during the 3rd course, a seared duck breast with cherry reduction that I was actually looking forward to, that my mother leaned over and said, very quietly, The way she delivered all of her grenades. Your father and I will need the penthouse keys by end of the month. I set my fork down. I looked at her. I said, I'm sorry? And she said it again, louder this time, loud enough for the table to hear, loud enough for the tables on either side of us to go slightly still. The Tribeca penthouse, Elsa, you're doing well enough to rent something. Your father's firm needs a New York base of operations. It's a family asset. I felt the blood in my veins do something very specific. It ran cold, and then it ran hot, and then it settled into something I can only describe as clarity. Mom, I said, keeping my voice even, keeping my smile in place because there were 200 people and a photographer, and I was not going to give them what they wanted. That penthouse is mine. I bought it. My name is on the deed. There are no family assets involved. Don't be dramatic, she said. Everything in this family is not mine. I finished. That's interesting, because I didn't have a single family dollar when I built my company. Not one. But now that there's something worth taking, suddenly it's a family asset. The table had gone completely silent. Prescott was studying his duck. Bianca was staring at her champagne glass like it held the answers to the universe. My father was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, part warning, part something older and darker that I'd been trying to decode my entire life. What happened next is the part that people always want to know about. The part I can tell now because I'm on the other side of it. My mother stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She leaned toward me with 200 people watching and the string quartet playing something from Vivaldi in the background, and she said, very clearly, "You will give your father those keys, Elsa, tonight, or you will regret choosing your pride over your family." I looked at her. I thought about 20 years of that voice, 20 years of being the wrong daughter, the difficult one, the one who left and didn't look back and had the audacity to succeed anyway. I thought about the $40 I left with, the 12-hour days, the clients I won on nothing but my own name. And I said, clearly, calmly, loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear without question, no. That was when she slapped me. One clean motion. Her palm connected with my left cheek with enough force that my diamond stud earring, a pair I'd bought myself for my 35th birthday, princess cut, 2 carats, because I had earned every facet of them, flew off my ear and landed on the parquet floor with a sound that cut right through the Vivaldi. 200 people went absolutely silent. I felt the sting radiate across my face. I felt my eyes water, not from sadness, but from pure physical reflex. I did not cry. I bent down in my sage green bridesmaid gown, picked up my earring off the floor of the Langford estate, straightened up, looked my mother directly in the eyes, and walked out, outside on the steps of the Langford estate, with the Chicago October cold biting through my dress. I made a phone call, and everything that came after, every single thing, started right there. The man I called was named Theodore Brandt, Teddy. To the people who knew him well, which was a very short list, Teddy was not my boyfriend. He was not my lawyer. He was something more specific and more dangerous than either of those things. He was the man who had, for the past 2 years, been quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary precision building a case. About my father. About Fontaine Realty Group. About a particular series of transactions that looked, on the surface, like aggressive but legal commercial development deals, and looked, one layer down, like something else entirely. I called Teddy and I said 4 words. Tonight. We move tonight. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "She slapped me in front of 200 people. Teddy, I'm sure." There was a pause. Then, "I'll be there in 45 minutes. I went back inside. I sat down at the table. I replaced my earring. I ordered a glass of champagne and I watched my mother across the room, accepting condolences from relatives who hadn't seen what happened, pressing her cheek against theirs, laughing her careful laugh. My father caught my eye once. I held his gaze until he looked away first, which he did, which told me something I'd suspected for a very long time. He already knew what was coming. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. He knew he'd built something rotten, and he knew I was smart enough to find the rot, and he had been hoping. Banking, literally, that blood would keep me quiet. He had miscalculated. Exactly 43 minutes after my call, Theodore Brandt walked into the reception hall of the Langford estate in a charcoal suit with a briefcase and the calm energy of a man who had done this before and would do it again without losing a moment of sleep. He was not loud. He did not make a scene. He simply walked to the table where my father sat, set a single manila envelope on the white tablecloth between the centerpiece and the breadbasket, and said, "Mr. Fontaine, I'm Theodore Brandt, representing Elsa Fontaine. That's a courtesy copy. The original was filed with the SEC this afternoon." My mother turned around from where she'd been talking to Georgette Hallé. She saw Teddy, and then she started screaming. What was in that envelope? What had my father actually done? And why had I spent 2 years building a case I could have filed at any time but chose to file tonight? At my sister's wedding, in front of everyone who had ever watched my family perform its version of perfection, those answers are coming. But first, you need to understand what I found when I started digging. Because the thing my mother slapped me over, the penthouse, the keys, the entitled demand at a wedding table, was only the surface. Underneath it was a story that would make your blood run cold. A story about money that wasn't mine, and a story about money that wasn't theirs either. About a secret that my father had been keeping for 15 years. A secret that my sister, perfect, soft, agreeable Bianca, had known about for at least 5 of them. And a secret that changed everything I thought I understood about the family I came from and the woman I'd spent my whole life becoming. Here is what nobody in that reception hall understood when Theodore Brandt set that envelope on my father's table. It wasn't an attack. It was a conclusion. What looked like a daughter's revenge was actually the final chapter of a story I'd been reading for 2 years, one document at a time. In conference rooms and courthouse archives and the back booths of coffee shops in Lower Manhattan, where Teddy and I would spread paper across the table and follow the money like a thread through a maze. And the maze led somewhere I had not expected. It led back to me, 15 years ago, when I was 20 years old and still a junior at Northwestern and still naive enough to believe that my father's coldness was discipline rather than strategy. Reginald Fontaine made a decision. He had a client, a developer named Carver Osmond, old money Memphis family, the kind of man whose handshakes meant more than his contracts, who wanted to build a mixed-use development on a parcel of land on the south side of Chicago. The deal was complicated. The financing was structured through 3 shell companies, and one of those shell companies, this is the part that took Teddy 8 months to untangle, was registered in my name, not with my knowledge, not with my consent, using a copy of my social security number and my birth certificate that my father had in his files. I was a 19-year-old college student. I had no idea my name was on a shell company that had funneled approximately $4 million in investor capital through a series of transactions that, when Carver Osmond's development collapsed in 2018, left 12 investors with nothing and Fontaine Realty Group with a liability that somehow, legally, technically, in the most deliberately convoluted financial architecture I had ever seen, pointed directly to the shell company, which pointed directly to me. You understand now? He didn't just take from investors. He took from me. He used my name, my 20-year-old name, my future, my credit, my legal identity as a shield. And when the deal went bad, I was supposed to be the one holding the bag. The only reason I wasn't sitting in a federal investigation right now was that Carver Osmond's collapse had been ruled a market casualty. The investors had settled quietly and the shell company had been dissolved before anyone looked too hard. But the records were there. Teddy found them. 4 months of digging in Illinois Incorporation archives and SEC filings, and a very helpful forensic accountant named Stacy Drummond who had, it turned out, previously worked for Fontaine Realty Group, and left under circumstances my father had described as mutual, and Stacy described as I found. Something I wasn't supposed to find, and he paid me to disappear. Stacy did not disappear all the way. Stacy kept copies. That was what was in the envelope. That was what the SEC filing contained. Not just the shell company, the whole architecture, every layer, every signature, every transaction, every piece of evidence that Reginald Fontaine had used his own daughter's identity, illegally, deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing, to insulate himself from liability on a deal that cost real people their real savings. Now, here's the part about Bianca. This is the part one had not planned on sharing tonight. This is the part that still sits in my chest like a stone I don't know how to put down. 6 weeks before the wedding, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words and a file attachment. She knew Elsa. The attachment was a screenshot of a text conversation between my sister Bianca and my father, dated March 2023, 2 years ago. In it, my father had explained, in terms that were not ambiguous, what he had done with my name 15 years prior. He'd told Bianca because Bianca was his favorite, and because he'd needed someone to help him manage something. A document that needed to be shredded. A conversation that needed to happen with a particular attorney. Bianca had replied, "Okay, Daddy, I'll handle it. Elsa will never find out." I read that text message standing in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, in my Tribeca penthouse, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and something in my chest that I cannot describe and will not try to. She knew. My sister, who I had flown in from New York to stand up for at her wedding, who I had written a speech for that made 200 people cry. She knew what our father had done with my name, and she had helped him keep it quiet. She had chosen him. She had chosen the zip code and the estate and the image and the Vivaldi at her wedding over her own sister's legal safety. Do you understand now why I picked tonight? Do you understand why I waited until the reception, until the duck breast and the champagne and the cathedral train and all 200 witnesses? Because they had chosen the performance of this family over everything, over ethics, over law, over me. And I wanted them to lose the performance in the same place they'd tried to run it. When my mother started screaming, it was not a dignified scream. Claudette Fontaine, who had never in my living memory raised her voice above a very controlled, cutting tone, came apart in the middle of the Langford Estate reception hall in a way that I think surprised even her. "What is this?" she kept saying, looking from Teddy to my father to the envelope. "Reginald, what is this?" My father had gone the color of old wax. He stood up from the table slowly, like a man who'd been expecting a car crash and was now simply assessing the damage. Prescott Hale, who had just legally attached himself to this family approximately 4 hours ago, was sitting very still with his attorney's brain almost visibly working. Behind his eyes, calculating exactly what this meant for him. Bianca stood up from her chair and looked at me across the room with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not guilt, something rawer than either. Something that looked like a person seeing themselves clearly for the first time and not liking what they found. "Elsa," she said, "just my name." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had shared a childhood with me, who had watched our father diminish me year after year and said nothing, who had actively helped him cover up something that could have destroyed my life. And I said quietly, because I did not need volume for this, "I know, Bianca." She sat back down. My father tried to speak to Teddy. He used the voice he used in boardrooms, authoritative, measured, slightly threatening in that way that had worked on contractors and city councilmen and junior associates for 40 years. Teddy smiled at him the way only a man with a completed SEC filing can smile and said, Mr. Fontaine, you're welcome to contact your attorneys tonight. The filing is public record as of 4 this afternoon. I'd suggest sooner rather than later. Then Teddy looked at me across the room and gave the smallest nod. I nodded back. He picked up his briefcase and walked out of the reception hall with the same calm energy he'd walked in with. While 200 wedding guests either stared openly or performed elaborate concentrations on their dessert menus, and here is what I want you to understand about what I felt in that moment. People assume revenge feels like victory, like a wave cresting, like justice arriving with trumpets. It doesn't. It feels like setting down something you've been carrying so long. You'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body, Dot. My mother had stopped screaming. She was standing in the middle of the room, looking between my father and the door and me. And for the first time in my 37 years of knowing her face, I saw something on it that I had never seen before. She looked frightened, not of what would happen to me, of what would happen to her, to the zip code, to the image, to the performance. That was the thing Claudette had always been most afraid of. Not harm, not loss, not even legal consequence, but exposure. Being seen without the costume on, I walked to my father's table. I stood in front of him. Up close, he looked older than I'd remembered, not old the way time makes you old, but old the way choices do. Hollowed out, like the architecture of the man was still there, but something essential had been quietly vacating the premises for years. I said, "The penthouse is mine, Dad. Everything I have is mine. You don't get to use my name for your mistakes and then show up at family events asking for my keys. It doesn't work that way." He said nothing. His mouth opened and closed. I said, "The 12 investors whose money went through my shell company, the one you opened in my name without my knowledge, they've been contacted. Stacey Drummond gave the SEC everything. And the set gave the DOJ everything. And right now, there are 3 attorneys in a conference room in Chicago working on a civil suit that will take Fontaine Realty Group apart piece by piece." He said, in a voice I barely recognized, "Elsa, you don't have to do this." I said, "You used my name, Dad. You used my name when I was 19 years old to protect yourself, and when it was over, you just left it there. Buried it. Hoped I'd never find it. And then tonight, you let Mom demand my home in front of 200 people, and when I said no, she hit me." I leaned forward just slightly. "I'm not the one who did this. You are. And now everyone in this room knows it." I turned to find Bianca. She was still sitting at the table, her cathedral train pooled around her chair, her bridal makeup immaculate, her champagne glass untouched. She was looking at me with those raw, clear eyes, and I could see her deciding something. "Didn't know what he was going to do with it," she said. Not loudly, just to me. "When he first told me, I didn't know it could have hurt you legally. But you knew he used my name without asking," I said. "And you helped him keep it quiet." She looked down at the tablecloth. "Yes," she said, very quietly. "Yes, I did." We stayed in that moment for a long beat. And then I said something I had not planned on saying. Something that came up from a place I hadn't expected. "I hope Prescott is a better choice than he seems." "I genuinely mean that, Bianca. I hope you get to have the life you actually want, and not the one Mom designed for you." She looked up at me. Her eyes filled, but she didn't let it spill. She said, "I'm sorry, Elle." It was the first time she'd called me Elle in years. I nodded. I picked up my clutch from the chair, and that was it. That was the whole scene, no fire, no further screaming. Just the quiet collapse of a 40-year performance. I walked out of the Langford estate into the Chicago October night, got into the car I'd hired, and rode back to the hotel where I was staying, not the family home. I had never considered staying in the family home, and I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my sage green bridesmaid gown with my earrings still in, and I called Teddy and said, "Okay." He said, "You okay?" I said, "I think so." "Everything filed?" He said, Everything's filed. I said, good. There was a pause. Teddy said, what do you want to do now? I thought about it. I thought about the $40 I left with. The 12-hour days. The clients I won on my name alone. The penthouse on the 53rd floor with the view of the Hudson that nobody had given me and nobody could take. I said, I want to go home to New York. The investigation took 14 months. Fontaine Realty Group was dissolved in a settlement. My father paid restitution to the 12 investors. Not enough, never enough, but something. He did not go to prison, which is a fact I have made a kind of peace with because the law is what the law is. And what I wanted was never incarceration. What I wanted was visibility. What I wanted was for the thing he'd done to be seen by the people whose respect he'd built his entire identity on. The SEC filing was public. The settlement was reported in the Tribune and picked up by 3 national outlets. Reginald Fontaine, who had spent 4 decades being one of the most respected names in Chicago commercial real estate, spent the following year explaining himself to every person who had ever shaken his hand at a gala. I think that cost him more than the money. My mother, I don't know what happened to my mother's inner life during that year. I know what happened on the outside. She and my father moved from Lakeshore Drive to a much smaller place in Evanston. She stopped chairing the charity committees she'd chaired for 20 years. She did not call me. I did not call her. Some doors, once they swing shut that way, require a very long time to re-examine. Maybe someday. Not yet. Bianca called me 4 months after the wedding. She was separated from Prescott. It turned out Prescott had opinions about marrying into a family. Under federal investigation that he had communicated somewhat less diplomatically than he perhaps should have, and Bianca had communicated back, and the whole thing had unwound relatively quickly. She was living in a rental in Wicker Park. She was seeing a therapist. She said, I've been thinking about what you said, about living the life I actually want. I said, yeah? She said, I don't actually know what that is yet. I said, that's okay. Figuring out what it is, that's the work. There was a long pause. Then she said, I'm sorry I didn't protect you, Elle, when it mattered. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I know. We talked for 2 more hours that night. We've talked most weeks since. It's not the same as it was. It's not the same as anything was, but it's real, which is more than we ever had before. The penthouse is still mine. The view of the Hudson is still mine. Fontaine Capital Management just brought on its 19th employee, and we are, by every metric I care about, doing exactly fine. My cheek stopped stinging approximately 4 minutes after I walked out of that reception. The earring is in my jewelry box. I take it out sometimes, not often, just sometimes, and I think about the moment it hit the parquet floor, the sound it made, the silence that followed, the choice I made to pick it up, put it back in, and walk out of the room that had never deserved me in the first place. Some families hold you together. Some families hold you back. The hardest thing I ever did was learn the difference, and the bravest thing I ever did was act on what I learned. The keys to the penthouse are on my kitchen counter, right where they belong, and they are never, ever leaving my hands again.
Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.